Good morning from Portland. Colin, consulting engineer at Juniper Networks, and in this video we're going to take the configuration that we ran through on the Catalyst 3750 in the last video. We're going to start picking it apart into kind of its base elements so that we can then convert it into a Junos config that will apply to an EX4300 switch. Now I like to divide and conquer on this, and there are some automation tools that you can use if you know Python. I'm going to show you the manual way that I use for doing some of the more simple configs that I sometimes work on. It basically just involves bringing up a text editor. I use Atom because I can split screen, putting the Cisco config on one side, and then marking the items that I've already done, and then building intent on the other side. We're not actually going to be doing the EX config specifically. We're just going to be sort of summarizing the elements that we need to put on. We don't need to do one-to-one. We just need to kind of create a checklist. So let me switch over to my workspace and let's get started. So I've got sort of the list of things we want to do here above me, and I've already brought the Cisco config into my editor. It's been a while. I don't really remember how to do this through console. I just copy and paste after a show run. I know with Juniper you can do things like SCP the files off, etc. I'm sure you can do that with Cisco. I just copied and pasted because it wasn't all that long. The first thing I'm going to do is actually eliminate the cruft. I don't need any of this stuff here. It's timestamps, all that. Don't need any of that. I'm not going to bother so much with the exclamation points because, well, that would take a little while. Let's get that out of there. Don't need you, don't need you. Let's see, that's all default. We don't have VTP on EX. Don't care about any of this crypto stuff. It can go bye-bye. Don't need to worry about this. And this is just going to reduce the amount of stuff we have to scroll through. Obviously, a lot of interface configurations. And this is also where creating your intent versus like a one-to-one can be time saving, particularly if you've got like a stack and you've got hundreds of interfaces to deal with. If you're coming over from a template, you likely don't even need to do that kind of work. You already have a list of, you know, what ports get assigned to what VLANs, and you can start from there. For me, in my role, sometimes when I'm helping a customer bring a configuration over, I might not have access to a template or they might not use one, and they just send me the config. Keep going through, and that's enough tidying up. Not too much to pull out, but we don't need to deal with it. Now you might have your own way of marking things as done. I usually use a couple pound keys because that's my, remark out, I'm done with it kind of thought process. Now, when you go through this, it's something to keep in mind. You don't necessarily need to, sort your configuration this way, but just bear in mind that there's going to be common config and then there's going to be unique config. Common config is going to be the bulk, the stuff that's going to apply to every device. These are usually going to be, or might, not be every single one, but, site specific. Things like DNS, NTP servers, if you've got syslogging set up. And then the unique stuff, host names, maybe some static routes. In our case, it's really just the host name and the management IP. Now, that's just, again, keep it in mind when you're building the intent for your EX. But you don't actually have to use that to sort. So let's get started. We have our host name, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to do this, and I'll fast forward through this part, and I'll just review what I've got at the end. So mute my mic, and I'll be right back. unmic them. Fine. All right, and I'm back. This whole process took me about 10 to 12 minutes, and of course your mileage is going to vary based on the size of the Cisco config that you're coming over from. But as you can see here on the right, the amount of lines that the intent of that configuration comprises is what, 65? And over here we're at 410. This is just a lot easier to consume. I mean, obviously we don't need to do all of these interfaces if they're grouped into similar roles by range. So when we go over to Juniper, we'll just use a range command. Obviously don't need to have all those lines in there. Let's go through this from the top. We've got the host name, which is lab1. I should probably put a colon there. We'll set the root password. This is something that is required. This is similar to the enable password. So we'll say enable here, maybe to be a little bit more clear for the iOS folks. We got to create a user. That's going to be an admin user or super user. We have a domain name, the DNS. We have our VLANs, and we have them broken up here by ranges. We've got 1 through 20 are access ports. Now this is something we'll see when we get over to the Juniper. It's 0 indexed. So we start at 0, and this kind of range will start at 0 and end at 19. There's just going to be a learning curve on that. It's going to get you a few times, but you'll get used to it. Everything else is 0 indexed, binary and all, right? So it's just, you'll get in the habit. We've got our guest VLAN. We're obviously trunking these on access point ports, which are going to be 41 through 46. We've got our management, which also has an IP address, the only IP assigned to the device. Point of sale VLAN, and there's voice VLAN, which isn't really explicitly applied to a configuration, but uses a voice VLAN configuration. PoE enabled on all ports. We don't have to worry about excluding the uplinks because they're SFP based. We're going to shut down any ports that we're not using. That's going to just be 2 on the uplinks, same as the Cisco. We've got a static default route, NTP server, use pool.ntp.org, which will likely mean that we're not going to have the same IP address as the Cisco, this one right over here, just because that will resolve, and it'll just grab whatever address happens to pop up during that resolution process. We'll set up spanning tree. There are PVST plus considerations I talked about in the last video. We're not really going to get into the rabbit hole of that. We're just going to set up an equivalent configuration, very basic on the EX. If you want more detail on that, just put a question in the comments and I'll answer it either in the comments or record another video on the topic. We're going to enable SSH, and we have an option on the Juniper to enable SSH for that root account. I'm going to do that just for the sake of doing it and showing you how it's done. Usually the primary way you're going to access a device is going to be through a service account that you create. And in this case, that's the lab account that we saw higher up in this configuration. We'll create an ACL to constrain access to that management IP to just devices that are connected to that management network. I mean, obviously I'm coming in through console, so it's a different set of rules, but we'll do that and we'll test it with the Raspberry Pi. We've got to build that 2-member LACP uplink to the SRX that we're using as our simulated core gateway. And we're going to disable HTTP HTTPS management. I noticed going through the Cisco config that this was here. Always turn that off. Always turn that off. And then we'll put in our message of the day. So this is it. This is pretty straightforward. I'll put this in the video description just so you have it as a reference. And we'll start diving into this in the next video, and we'll tackle the different elements of this section by section. So the next videos are probably going to be fairly short, but altogether they will comprise the complete configuration for this Cisco device. And then we'll swap cables and see how everything works. Until then, thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. And again, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Take care.